As the Indians continued to travel hard without let up, George wondered if they would ever reach wherever they had set out for. He imagined that they would ride on and on until he finally dropped from Nico's back to the hard ground. How much farther must we go? George would call ahead to Wonsack, but the Indian always continued to look straight ahead as though he had not heard. But one day, as they rode through an area particularly thick with trees and brushes, George's sharp eyes caught the light of a clearing up ahead. Clearings had been few in this section of the woods, so he felt anxious to see what it would be. Then he rode onto a low hill that lay directly before the clearing, and the sight that met him took George totally by surprise. A vast body of deep blue water, stretching as far as he could see, lay before him. At first, George thought it must be the ocean, but then he remembered that Pa always said the ocean roared louder than a bear and had mighty waves that foamed white with salt. This water lay still, quiet, shimmering in the glow of the afternoon sun. No, this must be one of the big northern lakes his schoolmaster back in Germantown had talked about. The teacher had said that five of them lay in the area near Canada and had pointed on the map to show how big they were. Anyway, George thought, I know we've been riding north, and this certainly is the biggest lake I've ever seen. Then far down the shore of the lake, George saw something he had not noticed before, a huge Indian village. Indians swarmed among long lodges and smaller wigwams. Squaws bent over fires, tending to their cooking, and children seemed to be running everywhere. George noticed something particularly strange near the center of the village. Dozens and dozens of Indian boys about George's age seemed to be playing in a huge oval, almost as large as the rest of the village, and surrounded by a low dirt wall. The boys ran, jumped, wrestled, and performed stunts of all kinds on the oval, smooth dirt floor. George couldn't imagine why the boys ran around as they did. Yet he wished he could be in the oval playing with them. Now George looked up to discover that the rest of his group had ridden ahead. So he dug his heels into Nico's flanks and rode hard to catch up. Shouts of welcome came from the village when the people caught sight of the returning party, and the braves returned the shouts with whoops and hollers. George thought he had never heard such noise in all his life. After the shouting had died down, the village people began looking around to see what the braves had brought home with them. That's when they discovered George. George had ridden a little to one side, watching the excitement. Then an old squaw gave a weird cry and pointed her bony finger toward the pale faced boy on his pony. The people began moving toward him, and he soon found himself surrounded by noisy squaws and children. George guessed he must be an odd sight to them, though he had become tan from the sun and wind. His skin still looked paler than theirs, and much to his disgust, his light hair had grown and now lay in curly ringlets on his shoulders. He supposed that many of the Indians had never seen any kind of hair except their own straight black hair. At first, the squaws just looked and pointed at him. Then a few reached up dirty hands to touch his light face and ran their fingers through his curly hair. George sat still, thinking he would let them look until they grew tired and went away. But all at once he felt four strong hands lift him bodily from Nico's neck. The next thing he knew, he was being passed bodily from squaw to squaw they as though he were a weak papoose. One would pull his arm in one direction and another his leg in the opposite direction, all trying to look him over at once. They laughed and chattered, but George had become so upset he couldn't understand a word they said. Now George was scared. What did they want to do with him? Did they want his arms and legs to see if he felt fat enough to eat? Did they feel his arms and legs to see if he felt fat enough to eat? Did they run their fingers through his hair because they wanted it for a scalp? Then a tall, handsome Indian man, dressed in beautifully beaded buckskin pants and shirt, stepped before the circle of women. They instantly became quiet and dropped George to the ground. The man took George by the shoulder and led him toward the village, past the oval where the boys stopped playing to stare at George, and on to a huge wigwam. George saw that this wigwam stood taller than any others in the village. Bright designs of beads and trinkets decorated the sides. The Indian lifted a soft black bearskin which served as a wigwam door and gently pushed George inside. As his eyes became used to the dimness of the wigwam, George noticed piles of heavy blankets heaped to one side. Soft skins covered the floor and felt warm under his feet. Now he looked into the face of the Indian who had brought him here. The Indian stood tall and straight, with great muscles bulging beneath the rough sleeves of his shirt. George had never seen broader shoulders. Not a muscle moved in the Indian's strong bronze face. But when George met his eyes, they glowed like live coals. Yet the deeply lined face did not look evil or unkind. After a few more seconds, the Indian turned and walked out of the wigwam, leaving George alone. George ran his fingers over the walls, and they felt soft and smooth. Looking closely, he saw they had made from many animal skins sewed together so skillfully that they seemed to be one piece. George noticed, too, that this wigwam was kept neat and clean. A huge bearskin hung from the side of the wigwam, and as George gazed at it, he noticed it seemed to move as though it were alive. A chill of fear ran through George. Someone was hidden behind that skin and watching him. Then a corner of the skin was pushed aside, and there stood a little Indian maiden. The girl stood so still that she resembled a wooden statue more than a human being, and George was amazed at how pretty she looked. Her big black eyes stared steadily at him without blinking. Her face was small featured, with high cheekbones, and her red lips. She had strands of colored beads braided into her long black hair, and she wore a beaded deerskin dress. Tiny moccasins covered her feet. But George didn't have long to gaze at this unexpected vision, for an old, wrinkled hand poked out from behind the rug and snatched the little girl out of sight. Who is that pretty little girl? He wondered. What is she doing here? And what am I doing here? He suddenly felt too tired to care. Nobody had been unkind to him, and this place felt warm and comfortable. Why should he worry? The heap of blankets looked inviting, and after after many long days of hard riding, abruptly he laid down on them and soon fell fast asleep. A few hours later, George was awakened by hands tugging at his shirt. He woke up to stare into the face of two Indian squaws. He saw that one held a round pot and something moved in it like liquid. Maybe they've brought me some food, George thought, and he realized that he did indeed feel hungry. But the squaw set the pot on the ground and joined the other one who was still tugging at his shirt. "What are you doing?" George yelled in English, then realized they couldn't understand. He repeated in Indian, "What are you doing?" The squaws looked at each other and giggled. "We make you look like fine Indian," one of them said. Then they began in earnest to remove his clothes. George kicked and twisted, but the squaws were stronger than he, and they soon had him undressed. Then the one picked up her pot while the other held him down. She dipped a white cloth into the pot, and the cloth came out brown. Then she quickly smoothed the cloth over his body, and George felt shocked to see his own skin turn brown. "Hey, stop that! What do you think you're doing? You're ruining my skin!" George protested in vain, for the squaws just worked all the harder. When they had finished staining him brown, they cut off his long hair. Reaching his hand to his head, George could feel only a narrow strip of short, stubby hair going from his forehead to the nape of his neck. Then they swabbed this with their stain and turned it as black as they could make it. "You've turned me into an Indian," George said sadly, poking a brown arm toward one of them. But the squaws paid no attention, and soon had him dressed in a new pair of buckskin pants and a beaded buckskin shirt. Then, with a satisfied smile, they led him outside to the Indian who had brought him to the wigwam. The Indian sat cross-legged on the ground, smoking a pipe that had a long feathered handle. He slowly pulled the pipe from his mouth and looked George over carefully from head to foot. Then he gave a grunt of approval. "I am Big Wolf, chief of this tribe," the Indian said. "Many moons ago my squaw died and left me with Inwa, my girl Papoose, in the light of my heart. But she left me no boy Papoose. Big Wolf has need of a son. From now on, you are my son. You must always be strong and brave. You must be a good Indian, learning to do things better than all other Indian boys. And you must become a mighty warrior and leader of people." Then Big Wolf fell silent with a wave of his hand, dismissed George. George was amazed to learn that he had become son of an Indian chief. Was this why he had been stolen from Ma and Pa in the first place? So the chief could have a son? And had the Indians forced the long ride to this village in cold weather because the chief was anxious to see his new son? George wondered if the chief felt pleased with him, but he figured he would probably never know for certain the answers to these questions. He walked into the village and tried to decide what to do. He had never felt more out of place. He knew that his skin and hair and even his clothes now made him look Indian, but his heart felt he could never really be an Indian. He looked at one bronzed arm and then the other and felt sad. Ma and Pa wouldn't even recognize him. "Do not look so fearful, little brave. A familiar voice spoke behind him, and George turned to face Woonsack. "Oh, Woonsack, where have you been? Look what they have done to me." George stuck out an arm for Woonsack to see. Woonsack smiled. "That is only dye from some roots in the forest. It will come off soon and have to be done again. It will have to be done many, many times so long as you live." This made George feel better. At least underneath the paint, he was still a German boy. "Since you are son of Big Wolf, you must look like an Indian." "But I don't want to be son of Big Wolf. I want to stay with you." "You will like being son of Big Wolf. He is a mighty chief and a brave warrior. He is good, and his people love him. You too will love Big Wolf." George wanted to shout that he could never love being the son of these Indians who lived so differently from what he was used to and from who had stolen him away from Ma and Pa. But he knew that he must not dare say such a thing, so he said nothing. Woonsack will be near. My wigwam is on the other side of the village. Sometimes Woonsack will come to see you." Then a wrinkled old squaw came up to George and led him away. On the other side of the squaw walked the little Indian maiden George had seen in the wigwam. George guessed by now that she was Inwa, the daughter of Big Wolf, the daughter Big Wolf had mentioned. Inwa held tightly to the squaw's hand and peeked around her skirts at George. They stopped at the wigwam of Big Wolf and sat down under the outdoor cook fire. Sat down by the outdoor cook fire. The chief soon joined them, and the squaw dished up a big pot of venison stew. While while Big Wolf ate, he lifted chunks of lean meat from the pot, pulled out the choicest bits, and popped them into the mouths of George and Inwa. The little girl was obviously used to this attention from her father, but George hardly knew what to do. As they ate, the old squaw watched them closely, dishing up more meat and corn or handing them a bit of cloth to wipe their greasy fingers on. But she did not eat. Like all good Indian squaws, she waited until the others had eaten. Then she would feed herself from what was left. When they had finished the stew, the squaw handed each one of them a flat cake baked to a tasty brown. George bit into it, and it tasted like corn cakes his mother sometimes made by mixing pound corn with milk, fat, and leavening. "Is this not the best food young Brave has eaten?" the chief said proudly. "It is very good. Young Brave will have many good things to eat, and he will always have warm clothes, many bows and arrows, and swift ponies." "Oh, but I have a pony, a brown and white one named Nico." "Big Wolf's son will have many ponies." After the chief took his last bite of cake, he rose and walked into the village. The squaw led George inside the wigwam and pointed to the blankets and said, "Sleep." Then she left him alone. George didn't feel like sleeping. He gazed around at his new home and was again surprised to see how clean it looked. Ma would feel better if she could know he lived in such a nice, clean place. Maybe this business of being a chief's son wouldn't be so bad after all. George leaned on the blankets and, without realizing it, fell asleep. He awoke later and found little Inwa staring down at him. "Hello," George said in the Indian language he had learned. "Hello," she said shyly. "Do you live in this wigwam too?" No, you live here with Big Wolf. You are my brother. I love you. This statement surprised George, and he jumped when he heard another voice behind him. Inwa lives with me in wigwam across from this wigwam. George did not even have to turn around to recognize the crackly voice of the old squaw. This wigwam is the home of Big Wolf. Now it is your home too. The squaw stood up and laid some blankets on top of a pile of skins by one wall. The night is dark now. You will sleep here, she said to George, pointing to the skins. Then she led Inwa outside. When George lay down on the skins, he found they made a bed as soft as a feather mattress, as soft as a feather mattress on Ma and Pa's bed. He remembered how good that mattress had felt to him when the hatchet had flown off its handle and struck his head. He reached up, he reached a hand up and ran his fingers across the rigid scar, barely hidden by his close cropped hair. Thinking of that feather bed made him feel a little homesick, and once again he told himself that he would someday escape. But I must not let being a chief's son make me forget who I am, he reminded himself. I am George Augustus Boland, and whatever Indian name they give me, I will still know who I really am.